Along the banks of the Tiber River, where the water moves slow and brown through a landscape of low hills and marshland, there existed a world long before Rome was ever imagined. The land here, in the region known to later generations as Latium, rolled gently from the volcanic uplands to the coastal plains, a patchwork of forest and meadow, seasonal streams cutting through soft tufa stone. The hills that would one day bear the weight of temples and forums rose quietly from the earth, unremarkable except in their number, 7 of them, clustered together where the river bent and widened, creating a natural crossing point between the interior and the sea. In the centuries before the city that would change the world, this was a place of small communities, scattered settlements of people who lived in wattle and daub huts with thatched roofs, who buried their dead in ceramic urns, who worked the soil and tended livestock in patterns their ancestors had followed for generations. The archaeological record speaks of them in fragments, post holes marking where timber frames once stood, layers of ash from cooking fires, shards of impasto pottery decorated with simple geometric patterns, the occasional bronze fibula or iron knife laid in a grave. These were the people of the Latial culture, part of the broader Iron Age world of central Italy, connected by trade and kinship to similar communities throughout the region. They were not isolated. Pottery styles moved between settlements, bronze objects traveled along exchange networks, and the influence of more sophisticated neighbors to the north, the Etruscans, and to the south, the Greek colonists, who had established cities along the coast of Campania and Sicily, filtered through in subtle ways. But for the most part, life here was modest, pastoral, bounded by the rhythms of seasons and harvests. The hills themselves were not yet united. The Palatine, where later tradition would place the first settlement of Romulus, shows evidence of habitation from at least the 10th century BC. Excavations have revealed the foundations of primitive huts, their oval outlines preserved in the bedrock, along with pottery and animal bones that speak of daily life. The Capitoline, the Quirinal, the Esquiline, and the others each had their own small communities, perhaps allied by kinship or language, perhaps rivals competing for resources and prestige. Between them, the low-lying areas remained marshy, prone to flooding when the Tiber rose in winter and spring. To stand in this landscape before Rome is to encounter a world that seems impossibly distant from the marble and grandeur that would later occupy the same ground. The Forum Roman, which would become the beating heart of republican politics, was then a marshy valley used for burials, a necropolis where the dead were cremated, and their ashes placed in ceramic containers shaped like the huts of the living. These hut urns, discovered by archaeologists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, provide a haunting connection to that earlier world, miniature houses for the dead, complete with tiny doors and peaked roofs, preserving the memory of architecture that has otherwise vanished entirely. The people who lived here were not illiterate in the way we might imagine, but their world left little in the way of written record. What we know of their language, if they spoke an early form of Latin or something related to it, comes from much later inscriptions and the linguistic analysis of place names and ritual formulae preserved in Roman tradition. What we know of their religion comes from votive deposits, from the locations of later temples that may have stood on earlier sacred sites, from the practices that survived into historical times and were attributed to antiquity. They worshipped gods of the home and hearth, of springs and groves, of boundaries and thresholds. They made offerings to ensure good harvests, to protect their flocks, to honor the dead. The Tiber itself was both highway and boundary. It connected these inland communities to the wider world, allowing trade goods to move up from the coast, salt from the marshes at Ostia, pottery from Greek workshops, bronze from Etruscan foundries. But it also marked a frontier. On the far bank, Etruscan territory began, and the cultural influence of that advanced civilization was profound. The Etruscans, with their sophisticated cities, their monumental tombs, their elaborate religious practices, and their mastery of metallurgy and engineering, represented a different order of social complexity. They wrote in their own script, adapted from Greek. They built in stone. They created art of remarkable beauty and skill. The relationship between the Latin communities and their Etruscan neighbors was complex. Trade brought Etruscan goods into Latium, and with them came ideas about urban planning, about kingship, about the proper way to honor the gods. Some scholars have argued that the very concept of the city, as opposed to the village or hilltop settlement, came to Rome from Etruscary. Certainly the architectural forms, the religious rituals, and even some of the political institutions that would characterize early Rome show strong Etruscan influence. But whether this influence came through peaceful exchange, through intermarriage and cultural borrowing, or through conquest and domination, remains a subject of debate. What is clear is that by the 8th century BC, something was changing. The scattered settlements on the 7 hills were beginning to coalesce, to see themselves as connected, perhaps even as a single community. The reasons for this are lost to us. Perhaps it was defensive necessity in the face of external threats. Perhaps it was the ambition of local leaders seeking to expand their power. Perhaps it was simply the logic of geography. The recognition that control of this crossing point on the Tiber offered strategic and economic advantages. Whatever the cause, the process of synoikism, of coming together, was underway. The landscape itself would have looked different then. Dense oak and beech forests covered much of the surrounding countryside. Wild boar and deer moved through the undergrowth. Wolves, the animals that would later become so central to Rome's founding myth, were common in the hills. The marshes teemed with waterfowl. The river, before it was channeled and controlled, probably shifted its course with the seasons, leaving oxbow lakes and mudflats in its wake. To imagine standing on the Palatine Hill in, say, the year 800 BC, is to see a world of smoke rising from cooking fires, of thatched roofs clustered together, of narrow paths winding between huts, of women grinding grain on stone querns, of children playing in the dirt, of men returning from the fields with tools over their shoulders. It is a world without monumental architecture, without paved roads, without the apparatus of state bureaucracy. It is a world where leadership is personal and probably hereditary, where disputes are settled by custom and the judgment of elders, where war is a matter of raids and cattle thieving rather than organized campaigns. And yet, within this modest world, something was stirring. The seeds of Rome were being planted, not in any single moment or decision, but in the gradual accumulation of relationships, alliances, shared rituals, and common identity. The people of these hills were beginning to think of themselves as distinct, as bound together by something more than mere proximity. They were developing institutions, religious festivals that brought different communities together, markets where goods were exchanged, possibly even rudimentary political assemblies where matters affecting the whole were discussed. The archaeological evidence for this transformation is subtle but real. The quality of pottery improves. Bronze objects become more common. The huts grow slightly larger, and in some cases, more permanent structures begin to appear. Defensive works, earthen ramparts and wooden palisades are thrown up around some of the hilltops. The burial practices shift, with inhumation gradually replacing cremation, possibly reflecting new religious ideas or contact with different cultural groups. And then, at some point in the 8th century BC, tradition tells us, Rome was founded. The date given by later Roman historians, 753 BC, is suspiciously precise, calculated backward from later events using various chronological systems, and probably more legendary than factual. But the general period seems right. Archaeological evidence shows a significant increase in settlement activity on the Palatine and adjacent hills around this time. The Forum Valley begins to be drained, possibly suggesting a coordinated effort by multiple communities. Fortifications are strengthened. The character of the settlement changes from a collection of villages to something that could legitimately be called a town. What drove this change? Climate, perhaps. A shift toward drier conditions that made the valley floors more habitable. Population pressure, forcing communities to organize more efficiently. External threats from Sabines or Etruscans. The ambition of powerful individuals or families seeking to consolidate power. Or perhaps simply the slow, organic process by which human settlements grow and evolve, responding to opportunities and challenges in ways that seem inevitable only in hindsight. The land itself offered advantages. The hills provided defensible positions. The Tiber allowed access to the sea and to inland trade routes. The ford here was the lowest practical crossing point before the river reached the coast, making it a natural gathering place for travelers and merchants. Salt roads from the coastal marshes converged here. The volcanic soil of the surrounding countryside was fertile. There was timber in the hills, clay for pottery and building, tufa stone that could be quarried and worked. In the quiet centuries before Rome, the land was preparing itself, almost unconsciously, for what was to come. The people who lived here, going about their daily lives with no conception of empire or republic, were nonetheless creating the foundation, linguistic, cultural, geographic, upon which something extraordinary would be built. They cleared the forests. They learned to work bronze and iron. They established trade connections. They developed rituals and customs. They told stories around their fires, stories that would be forgotten and reimagined countless times before being written down centuries later as the legends of Rome's founding. To walk this landscape now with the weight of 2,000 years of history pressing down upon it, is to feel the presence of that earlier, quieter world. Beneath the ruins of temples and forums, beneath the medieval churches and Renaissance palaces, beneath the modern streets and apartment blocks, the Seven Hills remain. The Tiber still flows, though captured now in stone embankments, and somewhere deep in the earth, the post holes of those primitive huts survive, waiting to be discovered by some future archaeologist, bearing witness to the world that came before Rome, the world that made Rome possible. The wind moves through the umbrella pines. Shadows lengthen across the hills. In the valleys, the last light catches the stone of ancient walls, and if you stand very still, and let the noise of the present city fade into the background, you can almost hear the echo of that older time, the lowing of cattle being driven home, the clang of a bronze hammer on an anvil, the voices of children playing in the dust, the slow, patient rhythm of a world that did not yet know it was about to change forever. The story begins with a basket floating on the Tiber, two infants inside, abandoned to the river's mercy. The current carries them downstream, away from the Alban Hills where their mother, a Vestal virgin named Rhea Silvia, had given birth to them in secret, the result of her violation by the god Mars. Their great-uncle, Amulius, who had seized the throne of Alba Longa from their grandfather, Numitor, had ordered them drowned. But the basket catches on the roots of a fig tree at the base of the Palatine Hill, and there the babies are discovered not by human hands but by a she-wolf who has come down to the river to drink. The wolf, rather than devouring the helpless children, nurses them. Later, a shepherd named Faustulus finds them and takes them home to his wife Acca Laurentia, who raises them as her own. They are named Romulus and Remus. They grow strong and bold, natural leaders among the shepherds and herdsmen of the hills. Eventually they learn their true identity, overthrow Amulius, restore their grandfather to his throne, and set out to found a city of their own at the place where they were saved, the Seven Hills by the Tiber. But there is a problem. Both brothers wish to be king. They agree to let the gods decide through augury, the interpretation of bird flight, an Etruscan practice that would remain central to Roman religion. Remus, standing on the Aventine Hill, sees 6 vultures. Romulus, on the Palatine, sees 12. The sign seems clear, but the brothers quarrel. When Remus mockingly jumps over the boundary his brother has marked out for the new city, Romulus kills him, declaring that so shall die anyone who crosses my walls. Rome is founded in blood, in fratricide, in 753 BC according to the traditional date, and Romulus becomes its first king. This is the story Rome told about itself for centuries, elaborated and refined by generations of poets, historians, and mythmakers. Livy tells it. Virgil weaves it into the Aeneid, connecting Rome's founding to the fall of Troy and the wanderings of Aeneas, who in some versions is the distant ancestor of Romulus and Remus through his son Ascanius, founder of Alba Longa. Plutarch records multiple versions, acknowledging contradictions while preserving the essential narrative. The tale becomes canonical, taught to Roman children, depicted in art, invoked in political rhetoric, celebrated in festivals. For centuries, scholars dismissed the whole thing as pure legend, invented to give Rome a suitably dramatic origin story. But then archaeologists began digging on the Palatine Hill. In the 1940s and 50s, excavations revealed the remains of primitive huts dating to the 8th century BC, their foundations cut into the bedrock, their post holes still visible. The structures match descriptions in ancient sources of the Casa Romuli, the Hut of Romulus, which was maintained as a sacred relic into the imperial period. More recent work has confirmed and expanded these findings. There was indeed a significant settlement on the Palatine in the mid-8th century BC. The archaeological date and the legendary date align with remarkable precision. In 2007, Italian archaeologists announced the discovery of a cave beneath the Palatine, elaborately decorated with shells and colored marble, which they identified as possibly the Lupercal. The the sanctuary where, according to tradition, the she-wolf nursed Romulus and Remus. The identification remains disputed, and the cave has since become inaccessible due to structural concerns. But the discovery reignited interest in the relationship between myth and material reality. What are we to make of all this? Did Romulus actually exist? Almost certainly not as an individual historical figure. The stories about him contain too many mythological elements, too many borrowed motifs from Greek and Near Eastern legends, too many contradictions in the details. But did something happen in the mid-8th century BC that Romans remembered as their founding? Did some leader or group of leaders unite the scattered settlements on the hills into a single community? Did violence attend this unification? The archaeology suggests that yes, something significant did occur around this time. The myth of Romulus does more than simply mark a beginning. It establishes themes that would echo through Roman history. The fratricide, brother killing brother over power, foreshadows the civil wars that would tear the Republic apart centuries later. The she-wolf, nurturing but fierce, becomes the symbol of Rome itself, protective of its own but savage to outsiders. The Trojan ancestry, elaborated by later mythmakers, connects Rome to the Greek heroic tradition while simultaneously positioning it as Troy's avenger against the descendants of the Greeks. The story also addresses a practical problem that bothered ancient historians. Where did the first Romans come from? If Romulus founded a city on an empty hilltop, who were its citizens? The myth provides an answer that is both imaginative and revealing. Romulus declares his new city a sanctuary, a place of asylum where fugitives, outlaws, and refugees from neighboring communities can find safety. They come in droves, debtors fleeing creditors, slaves escaping masters, criminals seeking amnesty. Rome becomes a city of outcasts, of men without lineage or property, united only by their acceptance of Romulus's authority. But a city of men alone cannot survive. They need wives, families, continuity. The neighboring Sabines refuse to allow their daughters to marry these ruffians, so Romulus devises a plan. He announces a great festival, inviting the Sabines and other neighbors to attend. In the middle of the celebration, at a prearranged signal, the Roman men seize the Sabine women and carry them off. This is the rape of the Sabines, one of the most depicted scenes from Roman mythology in later European art. War naturally follows. The Sabine men, led by their king Titus Tatius, march on Rome to reclaim their daughters. But when battle is about to be joined, the Sabine women themselves intervene, rushing between the two armies, pleading with their fathers and brothers on one side and their new husbands on the other. Peace is made. The two peoples merge. Romulus and Tatius rule jointly until Tatius's death, and Rome becomes a mixed community, Latin and Sabine together. Again, the myth does important cultural work. It explains the presence of Sabine elements in Roman religion and custom, certain priesthoods, certain festivals, certain rituals that seemed foreign to pure Latin tradition. It establishes a pattern of incorporation, of taking in outsiders and making them Roman, that would characterize Roman expansion for centuries. It acknowledges, perhaps, genuine historical migrations and mergings of populations in early Latium, and it presents violence and accommodation as twin aspects of Roman identity, conquest followed by integration, warfare leading to unity. Romulus's reign, in the legendary account, lasts nearly 4 decades. He establishes the Senate, creates the division between patricians and plebeians, institutes the first military organization, and builds the first walls. He wins battles against neighboring peoples, he expands Roman territory, and then at the end, he is taken up to heaven during a thunderstorm while reviewing troops on the Campus Martius, transformed into the god Quirinus. No body is ever found. Some whisper that he was torn apart by senators who had grown resentful of his power, but the official story is apotheosis. The founder of Rome becomes divine, watching over his city from Olympus. The Lupercalia, one of Rome's oldest and strangest festivals, survived into the Christian era before finally being suppressed. Celebrated in mid-February, it involved young men, called Lupercali, running nearly naked through the streets of Rome, striking onlookers, especially women, with strips of goat hide. The festival was said to commemorate the she-wolf and to promote fertility. Its primitive, almost savage character suggests roots that go back far beyond written history, to the pastoral world of the pre-urban shepherds. The figure of the she-wolf herself, That iconic image of the bronze sculpture in the Capitoline museums showing the wolf with the twins beneath her is complex. The wolf portion of the statue is genuinely ancient, probably Etruscan, dating to the 5th century BC or earlier. The twins were added during the Renaissance, but the image wolf as nurse and protector was central to Roman identity from early times. Coins depicted it. Poets invoked it. It appeared on military standards. The wolf was Rome wild, fierce, protective of its own, dangerous to threaten. What does it mean to found a city with a myth like this? To tell your children that their civilization began with abandonment, divine intervention, animal nurture, fratricide, rape and war. Rome never shied away from violence in its self-conception. Other cities traced their origins to gods or heroes who brought civilization peacefully. Rome's origin was bloody, contested, built on conflict and incorporation. And perhaps that honesty, that willingness to acknowledge the brutality at the heart of state formation, was itself a kind of strength. Walking the Palatine Hill today, through the excavated remains of imperial palaces and republican houses, you can still visit the supposed site of the hut of Romulus, marked and preserved. Whether the huts whose foundations have been found are actually from the time of Rome's founding or slightly later doesn't really matter. What matters is that Romans themselves, 1,000 years after the legendary founding, still maintained this spot as sacred, still told the story, still believed, or chose to believe, that here, in this place, it all began. The fig tree where the basket caught, the Ficus Rominalis, was still being pointed out to tourists in the 1st century AD. Whether it was the same tree, whether it was even a descendant of the original, is beside the point. It was a fig tree, and it stood where tradition said it should, and therefore it was sacred. The myth had colonized the landscape, transforming ordinary geography into a sacred topography where every stone and spring and tree could tell a story about the beginning. And in the end, what the myth of Romulus reveals most clearly is how Romans thought about power, about legitimacy, about the relationship between violence and order. Romulus kills his brother and becomes king, but this fratricide haunts him. He builds a city, but it is a city of outcasts. He takes wives for his men by force, but this violence leads to peace and unity. He rules well, but disappears mysteriously, and whispers of murder follow him even into divinity. Nothing is pure, nothing is simple, everything is ambiguous. This is not the sanitized mythology of a people trying to hide their origins. This is a people staring directly at the messy, violent, complicated truth of how communities form, how states emerge, how order arises from chaos, and by encoding that truth in myth, by making it sacred and repeatable in ritual, by teaching it to every generation, Rome was in a sense inoculating itself against naive idealism. Power comes from violence, order requires force, unity demands sacrifice. These are the lessons of Romulus, and Rome never forgot them. The she-wolf still watches over the city, bronze and patient, in her museum on the Capitoline. The twins she nurses are Renaissance additions, but she herself is ancient, weathered, enduring. And if you stand before her and look into those metal eyes, you can sense something of what she meant to Rome, not just a symbol but a presence, a guardian, a reminder of the wildness that civilization never quite escapes, the ferocity that must be tamed but never entirely suppressed, the animal nature at the heart of even the most ordered state. The wind moves through the ruins. Tourists take photographs, guides recite the story in a dozen languages, and the myth persists as it has persisted for more than 2,000 years, because it speaks to something deeper than history, to the eternal questions of how we come together, what we sacrifice to build something lasting, and what it costs to transform a hilltop of huts into a civilization that would rule the world. After Romulus came 6 more kings, or so the tradition tells us, spanning a period of nearly 2.5 centuries, from the 8th century BC down to 509 BC, when the monarchy was abolished and the republic began. These are shadowy figures, some of them probably historical, others perhaps legendary, all of them filtered through layers of later interpretation and political manipulation. But their stories, preserved by Livy, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and other ancient historians, reveal something crucial about early Rome's development. Its gradual transformation from a simple hilltop settlement into a true city-state, and the profound influence of Etruscan civilization on that process. After Romulus's mysterious disappearance, the Senate appointed an interrex to govern temporarily, but the people and the Senate could not agree on a successor. Finally, a compromise was reached. Numa Pompilius, a Sabine from the town of Cures, known for his piety and wisdom, was chosen as the second king. Where Romulus had been a warrior, Numa was a priest. His reign, lasting more than 4 decades according to legend, was devoted entirely to peace and religious organization. Numa established the calendar, creating the 12-month year that, with later modifications, would become the basis for the calendar we use today. He founded the priesthoods that would structure Roman religion: the pontifices, the augurs, the flamines, the vestals. He built the Temple of Janus, whose doors would be closed in times of peace and open in times of war, and which, significantly, remained closed throughout his reign. He established the rituals and ceremonies that would regulate the relationship between Rome and the gods. In essence, Numa gave Rome its religious infrastructure, just as Romulus had given it its political foundation. The contrast between the two kings is probably deliberate, reflecting an ancient Roman ideal of balance, military strength tempered by religious piety, expansion alternating with consolidation, war followed by peace. Whether Numa actually existed as an individual is uncertain, but the reforms attributed to him almost certainly represent real developments in Rome's early religious organization, though they likely occurred over a longer period than a single reign. The third king, Tullus Hostilius, swung the pendulum back to warfare. His name, Hostilius, related to the Latin word for enemy, practically announces his character. He destroyed Alba Longa, Rome's mother city according to myth, and forcibly relocated its population to Rome, doubling the city's size. The famous story of the Horatii and Curiati, 2 sets of triplets, Roman and Alban, fighting a ritualized combat to decide the war, supposedly comes from this time. Tullus expanded Roman territory significantly, but his reign ended badly. According to legend, he was struck by lightning, killed by Jupiter for improperly performing a religious ritual, a warning that military power without proper respect for the gods leads to disaster. Ancus Marcius, the fourth king and traditionally the grandson of Numa, brought back the focus on peaceful expansion and infrastructure. He founded Rome's port at Ostia, at the mouth of the Tiber, connecting the city more firmly to Mediterranean trade. He built the first bridge across the Tiber, the Pons Sublicius, a sacred structure made entirely of wood without metal fastenings. He extended Roman territory to the sea and incorporated the Janiculum Hill into the city's defenses. If Tullus had been about conquest, Ancus was about consolidation and economic development. And then came the Etruscans. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, the fifth king, was not Roman by birth. He was the son of a Greek refugee who had settled in the Etruscan city of Tarquini, and he married an Etruscan noblewoman named Tanaquil. Ambitious and finding his foreign origins an obstacle to advancement in Tarquini, he migrated to Rome with his wife, where he ingratiated himself with King Ancus and was eventually chosen as his successor. With Tarquin, Rome entered a new phase. He brought Etruscan expertise in engineering, architecture, and political organization. He began draining the marshy valley that would become the Forum, a massive undertaking requiring sophisticated hydraulic engineering. He started the construction of the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, which would become the most sacred site in Roman religion. He introduced the games and spectacles that would become characteristic of Roman public life. He expanded the Senate and reorganized the army. He waged successful wars against the Sabines and Etruscans, bringing more territory under Roman control. The Etruscan influence on Rome during this period cannot be overstated. Before the Tarquins, Rome was essentially a large village. After them, it was a city in the full sense, with monumental architecture, organized urban planning, sophisticated religious institutions, and the apparatus of a state. The Etruscans, whose civilization had flourished north of the Tiber for centuries, were the most advanced people in Italy at this time. They had learned from the Greeks, adapting their alphabet, adopting aspects of their art and religion, while developing their own distinctive culture. Etruscan cities like Veii, Tarquini, Caere, and Volsci were wealthy and powerful, enriched by metal resources, copper, iron, and tin, and by trade with the Greek colonies to the south and with Carthage. They built in stone, created elaborate tombs filled with sophisticated grave goods, developed techniques of augury and divination, and organized their cities under kings and later oligarchies. Their language, written in an alphabet derived from Greek, remains only partially understood today, despite thousands of inscriptions. But their material culture, their painted tombs, their bronze work, their terracotta sculpture, reveals a sophisticated cosmopolitan people. When Etruscan kings ruled Rome, they brought this sophistication with them. The Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer that drained the Forum Valley, was an engineering marvel, and parts of it still function today, more than 2,500 years after its construction. The temple building techniques, the religious rituals, even the insignia of authority, the fasces, bundles of rods with an axe, symbolizing the power to punish and execute, the toga praetexta with its purple border, the curule chair, all came from Etruria. Tarquin's reign ended with his assassination, but his successor was his son-in-law, Servius Tullius, the sixth king, whose origins are murky. Some sources say he was born a slave or the son of a slave. Others give him noble Latin ancestry. What's clear is that he undertook massive reforms that reshaped Roman society. He conducted the first census, organizing the population by wealth rather than by birth, and reformed the army accordingly. The richest citizens, who could afford the best equipment, formed the heavy infantry. The poor served as light troops or were exempt from military service. This system, the Servian constitution, would remain the basis of Roman military and political organization for centuries. Servius also built a new wall around Rome, encompassing all 7 hills for the first time, the Servian Wall, substantial portions of which still survive today in various parts of the city. He reorganized the city into 4 urban tribes and created a network of rural tribes, establishing a system of territorial organization that would endure. He tried to establish peaceful relations with neighboring peoples through treaties rather than warfare. And he built temples, including one to Diana on the Aventine, which served as a focal point for the Latin League, an alliance of Latin cities that recognized Roman leadership. But Servius's reign ended in tragedy. Overthrown by his own son-in-law, the last king of Rome, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. This Tarquin, unlike his grandfather Tarquin Priscus, governed as a tyrant in the Greek sense, a ruler who had seized power by force and maintained it through fear. He ruled without consulting the Senate, executed or exiled his opponents, and led Rome into unnecessary wars. He completed the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline, making it one of the largest temples in the Mediterranean world, but he used forced labor and oppressive taxation to do so. The archaeological record from this period is complex but revealing. The temple foundations on the Capitoline, when excavated, confirmed the immense scale of the structure described in literary sources. The Servian Wall, built of massive blocks of tufa, shows sophisticated engineering. Pottery and metalwork from 6th century Rome include high-quality Etruscan imports alongside local production, suggesting a prosperous city well connected to regional trade networks. The Forum, no longer a cemetery but a paved public space, was taking shape as a political and commercial center. Yet there are also signs of tension. The fortifications suggest external threats or internal instability. The construction of temples and public works on such a scale suggests either great prosperity or ruthless exploitation of labor. The literary tradition of tyranny and oppression under the last Tarquin may be exaggerated. Winners always vilify those they overthrow. But the pattern is familiar from other Mediterranean cities of this period, where early kings gave way to aristocratic republics, often after the excesses of the last monarchs made their rule intolerable. What can we really know about these 7 kings? How much is history and how much is legend? The archaeological evidence confirms that Rome underwent dramatic development from the 8th to the 6th centuries BC, transforming from a collection of hilltop villages into a unified urban center with monumental architecture and sophisticated infrastructure. The Etruscan influence is undeniable in material culture, in religious practices, in political institutions, in urban planning. But the neat sequence of individual kings, each reigning for implausibly long periods, and each embodying particular virtues or vices, is almost certainly a later construction, an attempt by Roman historians to organize a complex and poorly documented past into a coherent narrative. Some of the kings may have been historical individuals. Servius Tullius and the Tarquins in particular show signs of historical reality. Others, like Numa, may be legendary figures created to explain the origin of institutions that actually developed gradually over many generations. What matters, perhaps, is not whether we can verify each detail, but what the story as a whole reveals about Rome's self-understanding. The kings represent stages in development: foundation, religious organization, military expansion, economic growth, Etruscan transformation, social reform, and finally tyranny and its rejection. Each king builds on the work of his predecessors. Each contributes something essential to Rome's emergence as a major power, and the sequence ends with the expulsion of kings and the establishment of the Republic, suggesting that monarchy had served its purpose and had to give way to a new form of government. The Etruscan period, especially, was crucial. Whatever we make of the specific stories about the Tarquins, it's clear that Rome in the 6th century BC was deeply embedded in the Etruscan cultural sphere, that it benefited enormously from Etruscan knowledge and expertise, and that it emerged from this period transformed, urbanized, monumentalized, politically organized in ways that set it apart from other Latin communities and prepared it for the expansion to come. The Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline, finally completed in 509 BC, according to tradition, the same year the monarchy was overthrown, stood as a symbol of this transformation. It was huge by Italian standards, rivaling the great temples of Greek Sicily and southern Italy. Its terracotta decorations were Etruscan in style. Its cult statue was said to have been created by an Etruscan artist, and yet it was thoroughly Roman in its dedication to the Capitoline triad of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, who would serve as protectors of the Roman state throughout its history. To stand among the ruins of that temple today, or rather, among the ruins of its later rebuildings, for it burned and was reconstructed several times, is to feel the presence of that transitional moment when Rome was becoming itself, when it was absorbing influences from more advanced neighbors, adapting them, transforming them into something distinctly its own. The Etruscans gave Rome tools, techniques, models, but Rome would use them to build something the Etruscans themselves never achieved, a state that would dominate first Italy, then the Mediterranean, and ultimately much of the known world. The last Tarquin, driven from Rome in disgrace, became a wanderer, seeking help from various Etruscan cities to regain his throne. He never succeeded, and in his failure, in the finality of his expulsion, we see Rome making a choice that would define its future, a choice to reject monarchy, to experiment with a new form of government, to become a republic. The age of kings was over. What came next would be stranger, more complicated, more contentious, and ultimately more enduring than anything that had come before. The final act of the monarchy began with violence against a woman and ended with the birth of a new form of government. The story, as preserved by Livy and others, carries the narrative weight of myth, even if the details are historically uncertain. But like the tale of Romulus, it reveals deep truths about Roman values and the political culture that was about to emerge. Sextus Tarquinius, son of the king, was encamped with the Roman army besieging the city of Ardea. One evening, drinking with other young noblemen, the conversation turned to wives and their virtue. Each man boasted of his own wife's excellence, until finally, to settle the matter, they decided to ride back to Rome unannounced to see what their wives were doing in their absence. They found most of the women at parties and entertainments, enjoying their freedom, but Lucretia, wife of Collatinus, was at home spinning wool with her servants, working late into the night, the model of Roman womanly virtue. Sextus, seeing her beauty and virtue, was inflamed with lust. He returned several days later when Collatinus was away, and as a family friend was welcomed as a guest. That night, he went to Lucretia's room, sword in hand, and threatened her. When she refused him, he said he would kill her and a slave and leave their bodies together, claiming he had found them in adultery, thus destroying her honor even after death. Faced with this threat, Lucretia submitted. The next day, she sent for her father and her husband. When they arrived with friends, including Lucius Junius Brutus, she told them what had happened, made them swear to avenge her, and then stabbed herself with a knife she had hidden in her clothes. She chose death rather than live with the stain on her honor, even though the rape was not her fault. Her last words were a declaration that though she absolved herself of sin, she would not absolve herself from punishment, and that no unchaste woman would hereafter cite Lucretia's example to live in dishonor. Her suicide galvanized the men around her. Brutus, who had previously played the fool to avoid the king's suspicion, his name supposedly comes from Brutus, meaning stupid, revealed his true nature. He pulled the bloody knife from Lucretia's body and swore an oath to destroy the Tarquins. The others joined him. They carried Lucretia's body to the forum, displayed it to the people, and denounced the crimes of the Tarquins, not just this final outrage, but all the tyranny, the forced labor, the executions, the contempt for law and custom. The people rose in revolt. The Senate met and voted to exile the king and his family. The army besieging Ardea mutinied when they heard the news. Tarquin the Proud, attempting to return to Rome, found the gates closed against him. He fled to the Etruscan city of Carrhae, and from there sought help from other Etruscan cities to regain his throne. He would spend the rest of his life in exile, dying in Cumae years later, never returning to Rome. In the king's place, the Romans established a new system. Instead of one king ruling for life, they would have two magistrates, called consuls, elected annually by the people. Brutus and Collatinus, Lucretia's husband, became the first consuls in 509 BC. The power that had been concentrated in one man was now divided between two, each with the power to veto the other, each serving for only 1 year. If both consuls agreed on a policy, they could act. If they disagreed, nothing could be done. The system was designed to prevent the emergence of another tyrant. This is the traditional story of the Republic's founding. Like the tale of Romulus, it contains clear mythological elements. The narrative is too perfect, too neatly structured around the violation of female virtue and male honor, the transformation of the fool into the hero, the dramatic oath and the public display of the body, the immediate uprising, and the unanimous rejection of monarchy. It follows patterns familiar from Greek accounts of tyranny and its overthrow. The date, 509 BC, is suspiciously round and has been calculated backward from later events rather than firmly established. And yet, something did happen around this time. The archaeological evidence shows significant changes in Rome at the end of the 6th century BC. The construction of monumental temples and public works which had accelerated under the Tarquins slowed or stopped. Etruscan influence, so strong in the previous decades, began to wane. New political institutions emerged, and Rome's relationship with its Etruscan neighbors shifted from alliance or subordination to rivalry and eventual hostility. The transition from monarchy to republic was probably not as sudden or as clean as the literary sources suggest. There may have been a period of instability, competing factions, uncertain authority. The office of consul may have developed gradually, rather than being instituted all at once. The expulsion of the Tarquins may have been part of a broader wave of political change sweeping through central Italy as aristocracies overthrew kings in various cities. But the Romans remembered it as a revolution, as a definitive break, and they built their political identity around that memory. The Republic was founded in opposition to monarchy. The word rex, king, became almost taboo. Even centuries later, when men like Julius Caesar and Augustus effectively ruled as monarchs, they could not use that title without risking assassination. The horror of kingship, the association of monarchy with tyranny, was deeply embedded in Roman political culture. The story of Lucretia served specific cultural purposes. It established that the honor of Roman women was more important than life itself, a theme that would recur throughout Roman history. It demonstrated that family honor was a public matter, that violations of private morality had political consequences. It showed that tyranny attacks not just the state but the family, not just public virtue but private virtue, and that when it does so, it forfeits all legitimacy. The figure of Brutus became archetypal. The man who hid his intelligence behind a mask of stupidity, who bided his time, who struck when the moment was right. He became a model for later Romans. More than 450 years later, Marcus Junius Brutus, claiming descent from this first Brutus, would assassinate Julius Caesar, believing himself to be following his ancestors' example, liberating Rome from tyranny once again. The irony is that in doing so, he helped precipitate the end of the Republic and the rise of the emperors, but that is a later chapter. The first years of the Republic were precarious. The exiled Tarquin didn't give up easily. He convinced Lars Porsena, king of the Etruscan city of Clusium, to march on Rome with an army to restore him. The siege that followed produced more legendary stories. Horatius Cocles defending the Sublician bridge single-handedly while it was cut down behind him. Mucius Scaevola thrusting his right hand into a fire to demonstrate Roman fearlessness. Cloelia leading a group of hostages in a dramatic escape across the Tiber. Whether these specific events happened is less important than what they reveal about the values the early Republic wished to instill. Individual courage in the face of overwhelming odds, sacrifice for the state. the importance of honor and reputation. These stories were told and retold, becoming part of Roman education, shaping how Romans understood themselves and their obligations to the state. Eventually, according to tradition, Porsenna was so impressed by Roman courage that he made peace without restoring Tarquin. The historical reality was probably less flattering. Porsenna may have actually captured Rome briefly or extracted harsh terms, but the tradition preserved Roman dignity and turned a possible defeat into a moral victory. The Republic's political structure evolved rapidly. The Senate, which had existed under the kings as an advisory body of elders, became the primary governing institution, dominated by the patrician families who claimed descent from the original senators appointed by Romulus. The consuls held executive power, commanding armies and enforcing laws, but they served for only 1 year and could not succeed themselves. Other magistracies developed: praetors to administer justice, quaestors to manage finances, censors to conduct the census and supervise public morals, aediles to oversee public works and games. But from the beginning, there was tension. The patricians, the old aristocratic families, held a monopoly on political and religious offices. The plebeians, everyone else from wealthy merchants to poor farmers, were excluded from power despite their numerical superiority and their service in the army. This division would dominate Roman politics for the next 2 centuries. The first consul, Collatinus, was forced to resign and go into exile despite having done nothing wrong, simply because he was a Tarquin by name and his presence was considered dangerous to the new political order. Even family connection to the old regime was enough to disqualify someone from participation. Brutus himself allegedly ordered the execution of his own sons when they were discovered plotting to restore the monarchy. The story, like so many others, may be legend, but it illustrates the ruthlessness with which the early republic defined and defended itself. The transition from monarchy to republic represented a fundamental reimagining of political authority. Under the kings, power had been personal, embodied in a single individual who ruled for life and passed power to a successor chosen by various means: divine will, senatorial selection, popular acclamation, or inheritance. Under the republic, power was institutional, held temporarily by elected magistrates, divided among multiple officers, and ultimately answerable to the Senate and, in theory at least, to the people. This was a radical experiment. Most Mediterranean cities were still ruled by kings or tyrants. Even the Greek city-states, some of which had developed early forms of democracy, were mostly oligarchies or tyrannies at this time. Rome's system of annual magistrates with divided power and mutual veto was unusual, unwieldy, prone to deadlock and conflict. But it was also flexible, capable of adaptation, and remarkably resistant to the concentration of power in any one person's hands. The Republic would last nearly 500 years, far longer than the monarchy that preceded it or the empire that would follow. It would conquer Italy, destroy Carthage, subdue Greece and the Hellenistic East, and create an empire spanning from Spain to Syria. And it would do all this while maintaining, more or less, its fundamental constitutional structure: elected magistrates, senatorial governance, and periodic assemblies of the people to vote on laws and choose leaders. But it would never be easy. The Republic was born in violence and upheaval, and it would be characterized throughout its history by conflict between patricians and plebeians, between rich and poor, between conservatives and reformers, between generals competing for glory. The stability and harmony that would later be projected back onto the early republic by nostalgic historians was largely illusory. From the beginning, Rome was a state in tension with itself, its various factions and interest groups struggling for advantage, finding temporary compromises that held until the next crisis. The year 509 BC, whether or not it marks the exact moment of transition, represents a turning point. Rome stepped away from monarchy and into something new, something experimental and dangerous and full of possibility. The Republic had begun. The long struggle to define what that would mean and who would control it was just beginning. In the Forum, where once the marshy valley had held burials, where the kings had built temples and paved spaces, the Republic would build its Senate House, its law courts, its speaking platforms. Here, politics would be conducted in public, under the eyes of the people, through persuasion and voting, and the slow accumulation of precedent and tradition. It would be messy, often violent, frequently unjust. But it would be theirs, not the possession of a king. but the common property of Roman citizens, to use and abuse, to defend and reform, to pass on to future generations. The experiment had begun, and the world would never be the same. For nearly 200 years, from the establishment of the Republic in 509 BC, until the codification of the 12 tables around 450 BC and beyond, Rome was consumed by internal conflict that threatened at times to tear the state apart. This was the struggle of the orders, the long battle between the patrician aristocracy who monopolized power and the plebeian majority who demanded their share. It was resolved not through revolution, but through gradual negotiation, concession and compromise, a characteristically Roman solution to what might have been a fatal crisis. The patricians claimed descent from the Hundred Fathers, the patres who had formed the original Senate under Romulus. They alone could hold the consulship and other high magistracies. They alone could become priests and interpret the sacred law that governed Rome's relationship with the gods. They controlled the Senate, the priesthoods, and through their clients and dependents, much of the popular assembly as well. They were, in essence, a closed caste, jealously guarding their privileges. The plebeians were everyone else. Some were wealthy, merchants, craftsmen, farmers with substantial holdings. Others were poor, landless laborers, urban workers, small farmers struggling to survive. What united them was their exclusion from political power. They could vote in the assemblies, but they could not hold office. They could fight in the legions, but they could not command. They were subject to laws interpreted by patrician priests and enforced by patrician magistrates, laws that often favored the wealthy and powerful. The first major crisis came early. In 494 BC, the plebeians, burdened by debt and military service, threatened with enslavement for non-payment, and excluded from political power, simply withdrew from the city. They marched out to a hill outside Rome, later sources call it the Sacred Mount, and established their own camp, declaring that if the patricians wanted to rule Rome, they could defend it themselves. This was a strike, a secession, a profound challenge to the very existence of the state. Without the plebeians, there was no army. Without the plebeians, the economy would collapse. Without the plebeians, Rome was nothing but a handful of aristocratic families claiming authority over an empty city. The patricians, faced with this crisis, negotiated. A settlement was reached. The plebeians returned to Rome, but they came back with a new institution, the tribunate of the plebs. Tribunes were magistrates elected annually by the plebeians themselves, charged with protecting plebeian interests. They had no formal power to command or to pass laws, but they had something almost as valuable, the power to veto. A tribune could say veto, I forbid, and any action by a magistrate or the Senate affecting a plebeian citizen would be nullified. More than that, tribunes were sacrosanct. Anyone who harmed or interfered with a tribune was declared homo sacer, an outlaw who could be killed by anyone without legal consequence. The plebeians had sworn a collective oath to defend their tribunes, to avenge any attack upon them. This was a quasi-religious sanction that made the office almost untouchable. Initially, there were just 2 tribunes. The number later increased to 10. They could not leave Rome for more than a day because their protective power extended only within the city boundaries. They could not be patricians. They were elected exclusively by and from the plebeian population, and they quickly became a powerful force in Roman politics. But the tribunes alone were not enough. The plebeians still faced fundamental problems. The laws were not written down. They existed in the memory of the patrician priests and magistrates who interpreted them. This meant that law could be manipulated, that precedents could be invented or ignored, that plebeians had no way to know what was actually legal. Justice, such as it was, depended on the whims of patrician judges. Moreover, debt remained a crushing burden. Roman law allowed creditors to enslave debtors who could not pay. A small farmer who borrowed seed grain or money for taxes, and then suffered a bad harvest or was called away for military service, could find himself unable to repay. He would become nexus, a debt bondsman, forced to work for his creditor until the debt was paid. In practice, this often meant permanent slavery for himself and his family. The plebeians demanded 2 things: written law, so that everyone could know their rights, and debt relief, so that citizens would not be enslaved by their fellow citizens. The patricians resisted both. Written law would limit their ability to interpret tradition in their own favor. Debt relief would harm their financial interests and set a dangerous precedent. The conflict escalated. There were further secessions, threats of violence, political deadlock. Finally, around 450 BC, another compromise was reached. A commission of 10 men, the decemviri, was appointed to write down the laws. They worked for 2 years, studying the laws of other Greek cities, consulting Roman tradition, and drafting a comprehensive legal code. The result was the 12 Tables, bronze tablets inscribed with laws governing everything from property rights to inheritance, from procedure in lawsuits to penalties for various crimes. The laws were displayed in the forum, where anyone could read them. They were taught to children as part of their education. They became the foundation of Roman law for centuries to come. The 12 Tables were not, by modern standards, particularly enlightened. They included harsh provisions, death penalties for various offenses, rights of fathers to sell their children, legal distinctions between patricians and plebeians. But they were published, fixed, and knowable. They could be cited and invoked. They removed the mystery from law and made it, at least in principle, something accessible to all citizens. The code addressed debt, though not in the way plebeians might have hoped. It regulated the conditions of debt bondage, but did not abolish it. It would take another crisis, another secession, and further negotiations before Nexum was finally abolished in 326 BC, ending the practice of debt bondage among Roman citizens. The 12 Tables included memorable provisions. If a patron defrauds his client, let him be accursed. If a tree from a neighbor's farm is bent by the wind and hangs over your farm, you may cut off the overhanging branches. Women shall remain in guardianship, even when they have attained their majority. Some provisions were procedural: how to summon someone to court, how to give evidence, how to enforce a judgment. Others dealt with family law, property, trespass, assault. One famous provision addressed the terrible practice of dividing up the body of a debtor among multiple creditors if he could not pay. The 12 Tables stated that if a debtor was held in chains for 60 days and no one paid his debt, he could be sold into slavery abroad or killed, and if multiple creditors shared in his death, they could divide his body among themselves. Most scholars believe this provision was never actually carried out, that it was a legal fiction or a holdover from archaic practice, but its inclusion in the code shows how seriously Romans took the obligation of debt. The publication of the 12 Tables was a watershed. Law was no longer secret knowledge held by the patrician elite. It was public, permanent, and in principle at least, applicable to all. This did not mean equality. The laws themselves often favored the wealthy and powerful, but it meant that the rules were known, and that provided a foundation for further struggle and reform. The plebeians continued to push for access to political office. In 367 BC, after another prolonged conflict, the Licinian Sextian laws were passed. These required that one of the 2 consuls each year must be a plebeian. This broke the patrician monopoly on the highest office. Over the following decades, other offices were opened to plebeians: the praetorship, the censorship, even the priesthoods. By the end of the 4th century BC, wealthy and ambitious plebeians could hold any office in Rome. The old patrician monopoly was broken, but this created a new elite, the nobility, nobilitas, made up of both patrician and plebeian families whose members had held the consulship. This new aristocracy was no less exclusive than the old patriciate. It controlled the Senate, dominated politics, and passed privileges and power down through family lines. The distinction between patrician and plebeian persisted in ritual and religious contexts, but politically it became less important than the distinction between nobles and commoners, between those with ancestors who had held high office and those without. The conflict of the orders had been resolved, but not by creating equality. Rather, it had been resolved by opening the elite to talented and wealthy plebeians, creating a new mixed aristocracy. The institutions created during the struggle, the tribunes, the written law, the assembly of the plebs, became permanent features of the Roman constitution. The tribunes in particular became powerful political figures, able to veto legislation, to prosecute corrupt officials, to protect citizens from arbitrary punishment. In later periods, tribunes would become tools of populist politicians seeking to circumvent the Senate, and the office that had been created to protect plebeians from patrician oppression would become a weapon in the civil wars that would eventually destroy the Republic. But for now, in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, the system worked reasonably well. It provided channels for grievances to be addressed, for ambitions to be accommodated, for conflicts to be negotiated rather than fought. It was messy, contentious, often unjust, but it was also flexible, adaptable, capable of evolution. The struggle of the orders reveals something fundamental about Roman political culture. Romans were conservative in that they valued tradition, precedent, and the preservation of existing institutions. But they were also pragmatic, willing to negotiate, to make concessions, to reform when the alternative was collapse. The patricians could have held firm, could have used force to maintain their monopoly. They chose instead to compromise, to share power, to preserve the state by adapting it. This pattern would repeat throughout Roman history, periods of crisis followed by reform, of conflict followed by compromise, of revolution contained within constitutional forms. It was never neat. It was never fair to everyone, but it kept Rome together through centuries of expansion and change, allowing the state to grow from a single city to an empire spanning the Mediterranean world. The 12 tables, fragments of which survive in quotations by later authors, were already archaic in language and content by the late Republic, but they remained sacred, a symbol of law's foundation, the moment when Rome chose to govern itself by written rules rather than by the arbitrary decisions of kings or aristocrats. Every Roman schoolboy memorized passages. Lawyers cited them. They were the beginning of Rome's great legal tradition, the foundation upon which centuries of jurisprudence would be built. In the Forum, where the bronze tablets had stood, where citizens had gathered to read and discuss the laws, the business of the Republic continued, senators debating, tribunes vetoing, assemblies voting, courts rendering judgments. The struggle that had consumed 2 centuries had reshaped Rome, had created institutions that would endure, had established principles that would echo down through time. The plebeians had won access to power, the patricians had preserved their state, and Rome, tested by internal conflict, emerged stronger, more cohesive, more capable of meeting the challenges that lay ahead. For while they had been fighting among themselves, while they had been negotiating the terms of their society, Rome had also been expanding, conquering, transforming from a city-state into the dominant power in Italy. That story was unfolding simultaneously, and we turn to it now. The conquest of Italy was not a single campaign or a coherent plan executed by visionary leaders. It was a slow, grinding process that took more than 2 centuries, driven by a mixture of defensive necessity, opportunistic aggression, revenge for past defeats, and the steady accumulation of alliances and dependencies. Rome's wars with its neighbors began almost from the moment the Republic was founded and did not truly end until the Social War of the 1st century BC, when Rome's Italian allies finally became Roman citizens. But the critical period was from roughly 500 BC to 275 BC, when Rome transformed from one city among many in central Italy into the unquestioned master of the entire peninsula. The early Republic was surrounded by enemies and potential threats. To the north, the Etruscans remained powerful, their cities wealthy and well fortified. To the east and south, the Sabines, Equi, and Volsi pressed against Roman territory, raiding farmlands and threatening settlements. Within Latium itself, other Latin cities viewed Rome with suspicion, sometimes as an ally, sometimes as a rival, and beyond the immediate horizon, the Samnites in the central mountains and the Greek cities of the south represented future challenges. The first wars of the Republic were defensive, or at least were remembered that way. The exiled Tarquin had sought help from Lars Porsena of Clusium, and though tradition held that Rome heroically resisted, the reality may have been less glorious. Some ancient sources suggest that Porsena actually captured Rome briefly, or at minimum extracted heavy tribute. Regardless, Rome survived, and Porsena eventually withdrew, perhaps distracted by threats from Gauls moving into northern Italy. The Latin War of 493 BC saw Rome fighting against a coalition of neighboring Latin cities who resented Roman pretensions to leadership. The war ended with the formation of the Latin League, an alliance of Latin cities with Rome holding a position of first among equals. The League's forces fought together against common enemies, with command rotating among the member cities. This would be a pattern Rome would repeat throughout Italy. Alliances that began as partnerships among equals gradually became vehicles for Roman domination. Through the 5th century BC, Rome fought constant wars with the Aequi and Volsci, mountain peoples who raided into Latium during the summer campaigning season and then retreated to their hill forts when Roman forces came after them. These wars produced legendary figures like Cincinnatus, the farmer who was called from his plow to serve as dictator, defeated the enemy in 16 days, and then returned to his farm, refusing all honors and power. Whether the specific stories are true, they reflect the ideal of the citizen soldier, the Roman who fought when needed but preferred peace and agriculture. The war with Veii consumed much of the early 4th century BC. Veii was an Etruscan city only about 10 miles north of Rome, wealthy from agriculture and trade. Defended by massive walls and natural cliffs, it was a rival of long-standing, controlling territory and trade routes that Rome coveted. The war, according to tradition, lasted 10 years, echoing the Greek siege of Troy, though the reality was probably a series of campaigns and raids rather than a continuous siege. The fall of Veii in 396 BC, after Roman sappers dug a tunnel under the walls and emerged inside the city, marked a major expansion of Roman power and territory. The defeated city's land was divided among Roman citizens, doubling Rome's Ager Publicus, its public land. The victory also provided a massive amount of booty, enriching Roman soldiers and the state, but it came at a cost. The general who captured Veii, Marcus Furius Camillus, celebrated a triumph so lavish that it aroused jealousy and resentment, leading to his exile on charges of misappropriating plunder. And then came disaster. In 390 BC, a Celtic people the Romans called Gauls swept down from northern Italy, defeated a Roman army at the Battle of the Allia, and sacked Rome itself. The city was put to the torch. Most of its inhabitants fled. According to tradition, only the garrison on the Palatine Hill held out, warned of a night attack when the sacred geese of Juno raised the alarm. The Gauls eventually agreed to leave in exchange for a ransom of gold, but as the gold was being weighed, the Gallic chieftain Brennus threw his sword onto the scales, crying "Vae Victus," woe to the vanquished, forcing the Romans to pay even more. This humiliation burned in Roman memory. Later legends claimed that Camillus returned from exile with an army and defeated the Gauls before they could leave, recovering the ransom and saving Rome's honor. But the historical reality was probably that Rome paid the ransom and the Gauls left of their own accord, laden with gold. The sack of Rome taught lessons that would shape Roman policy for centuries. Walls had to be strong, armies had to be flexible and well-trained, and enemies had to be pursued and destroyed, not bought off and allowed to escape. The city was rebuilt, this time with the Servian wall fully enclosing all 7 hills in massive fortifications of tufa blocks. Parts of this wall still stand today, testimony to the determination to prevent another sack. But the disaster had also shown Rome's vulnerability. Other cities that had been allied with or subject to Rome saw an opportunity to rebel or to renegotiate their relationships. Rome had to reconquer much of what it had lost. The recovery was remarkable. Within a generation, Rome had not only rebuilt, but had expanded its power beyond what it had held before the Gallic sack. The key was the army. Roman military organization evolved rapidly during this period, moving away from the Greek-style phalanx toward a more flexible system based on the manipular legion. Instead of fighting in one rigid block, the legion was divided into smaller units, maniples that could maneuver independently, respond to terrain, and adapt to different enemies. This flexibility proved crucial in the long wars against the Samnites, the mountain people of central Italy. The Samnite Wars stretched over more than 50 years, from 343 to 290 BC, interrupted by truces and treaties that never lasted. The Samnites were fierce warriors, skilled at mountain warfare, capable of ambushing Roman columns in narrow valleys and then disappearing into the hills. They taught Rome hard lessons about overconfidence and the importance of logistics. The worst disaster came at the Caudine Forks in 321 BC, where a Roman army was trapped in a narrow pass, surrounded and forced to surrender without a fight. The Samnites made the Romans pass under a yoke, a symbolic humiliation, and sent them home disarmed and dishonored. Rome refused to accept the treaty made under duress, renewed the war, and over the following decades ground down Samnite resistance through sheer persistence and superior resources. The Romans learned to build roads to move armies quickly and to maintain supply lines. The Via Appia, begun in 312 BC by the censor Appius Claudius Caecus, ran from Rome to Capua and eventually to Brundisium on the Adriatic coast. It was an engineering marvel, running straight across the Palatine marshes on an elevated causeway, paved with stones fitted so precisely that much of it is still intact today. Other roads followed, the Via Latina, the Via Flaminia, creating a network that allowed Roman armies to move rapidly anywhere in Italy. The Romans also developed a new strategy for controlling conquered territory. Instead of simply demanding tribute and leaving local rulers in place, Rome established colonies, settlements of Roman citizens in strategic locations throughout Italy. These colonies served multiple purposes. They provided land for Rome's growing population, rewarded veterans with farms, secured key routes and mountain passes, and created centers of Roman culture and loyalty in conquered regions. A colony might be small, just a few hundred families, but it would be fortified, it would maintain Roman law and customs, and it would serve as a base for Roman power. Simultaneously, Rome created a complex network of alliances with Italian cities and peoples. Some became full Roman citizens, others became citizens without voting rights. They had the obligations of citizenship, especially military service, but not the full privileges. Still others remained nominally independent allies, bound to provide troops when Rome went to war, but otherwise self-governing. This system created a pyramid of relationships with Rome at the apex, drawing on the manpower of all Italy for its legions. By the early 3rd century BC, Rome dominated central Italy. The Samnites were defeated, their towns garrisoned or allied with Rome. The Etruscans, weakened by internal conflicts and pressure from invading Gauls, were reduced to subject allies. The Latin League had been dissolved after a rebellion in 340–338 BC, with the Latin cities absorbed directly into the Roman state or bound to Rome by individual treaties. Then Rome's expansion brought it into conflict with the Greek cities of southern Italy, Magna Graecia, as it was called. These were wealthy, sophisticated communities, founded centuries earlier by Greek colonists, maintaining connections with the Greek world across the Adriatic. When the Greek city of Tarentum, feeling threatened by Roman expansion, called for help from the Greek mainland, they invited King Pyrrhus of Epirus, one of the most skilled generals of the Hellenistic age, a distant relative of Alexander the Great. Pyrrhus arrived in Italy in 280 BC, with an army of professional soldiers, experienced in the wars that had raged across the Greek world following Alexander's death. He brought war elephants, which the Romans had never encountered. At the Battle of Heraclea, Pyrrhus defeated a Roman army, though at heavy cost. The Romans had never seen elephants in battle. They called them Lucanian cows and their horses panicked. But the Romans did not ask for terms. They raised another army. Pyrrhus won another costly victory at Asculum in 279 BC. When congratulated on his victory, he supposedly replied, "Another such victory and I am undone," the origin of the term Pyrrhic victory. The Romans just kept coming. They had enormous reserves of manpower, drawing on all their Italian allies. Pyrrhus had limited resources far from home, and every casualty was irreplaceable. In 275 BC, at the Battle of Beneventum, the Romans finally defeated Pyrrhus decisively. He withdrew from Italy, leaving garrisons behind that soon surrendered. Tarentum fell to Rome in 272 BC. By 270 BC, all of southern Italy was under Roman control. The Greek cities became Roman allies, required to provide ships and sailors for Rome's growing fleet. The conquest was complete. From the Rubicon River in the north to the Strait of Messina in the south, all of peninsular Italy recognized Roman supremacy. It had taken more than 2 centuries of almost constant warfare, but Rome had transformed itself from a single city into the master of a region with millions of people, commanding military resources no other Mediterranean power could match. The key to this success was not just military prowess, though Roman arms were formidable. It was the system of alliances and the incorporation of conquered peoples. Rome did not simply extract tribute from defeated enemies. It made them partners, though unequal ones. Italian allies fought in Roman armies, shared in the plunder of conquest, and benefited from the peace and trade that Roman power brought. They remained distinct, maintaining their own governments and laws, but they were bound to Rome by mutual interest and by the reality that resistance was futile. This system would be tested in the social war of 91–88 BC, when Rome's Italian allies, tired of providing troops without receiving citizenship, would rebel. But for now, in the 3rd century BC, it worked remarkably well. Rome had created something new in the Mediterranean world, not an empire of subject peoples paying tribute to a distant capital, but a confederation with Rome at its center, bound together by legal ties, military cooperation, and economic integration. The archaeological evidence of this expansion is everywhere in Italy. Roman roads, their paving stones still visible. Colonies like Cosa, Alba Fusens and Venusia, with their regular street grids, their walls, their forums. Latin inscriptions spreading throughout the peninsula. Pottery and coinage showing increasing standardization and trade. The physical infrastructure of Roman power, built to last. To travel these roads today, to walk the walls of these colonies, to stand in the ruins of theaters and temples built in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, is to see the bones of Roman Italy emerging from the landscape. The conquest was not just military, it was cultural, economic, infrastructural. Rome was weaving Italy into a single fabric, creating the foundation for the empire that would follow. But even as Rome secured its position in Italy, it was being drawn into a much larger conflict, one that would test its strength as never before, and would transform it from an Italian power into a Mediterranean superpower. Across the sea, on the coast of North Africa, the city of Carthage watched Rome's rise with growing concern. The stage was being set for the greatest conflict of the ancient world before the Roman civil wars. The Punic Wars, named for the Phoenician origins of Carthage, would reshape the Mediterranean and determine whether Rome's future would be Mediterranean Empire or Italian Confederation. The wind moves through the ruins of Cosa, the Roman colony on the Tuscan coast. The walls still stand, enclosing the ghost of a city. The forum is silent. The temples are roofless shells, but the street grid remains, geometric and precise, imposed on the landscape by Roman surveyors more than 2,000 years ago. This was the machinery of conquest, not just swords and spears, but roads and walls, colonies and alliances, the slow, patient construction of power. Rome had mastered Italy. The world was next. The Punic Wars, 3 epic conflicts spanning more than a century, from 264 to 146 BC, represent the defining struggle of the Roman Republic. These were not wars of expansion or conquest in the ordinary sense, but existential conflicts for survival and supremacy. Rome faced in Carthage an enemy of comparable strength, resources, and determination. The outcome was never certain. Rome came perilously close to defeat, especially during the Second Punic War when Hannibal Barca brought Rome to its knees. But Rome endured, and in enduring, transformed itself from an Italian power into the unquestioned master of the Western Mediterranean. Carthage was an ancient city, founded according to tradition in 814 BC by Phoenician colonists from Tyre in modern Lebanon. By the 3rd century BC, it was the wealthiest and most powerful city in the Western Mediterranean, controlling a maritime empire that stretched from North Africa to southern Spain, from western Sicily to Sardinia and Corsica. Carthaginian ships dominated trade routes. Carthaginian merchants grew rich from commerce in tin, silver, grain, and luxury goods. The city itself on the North African coast near modern Tunis was magnificent, with artificial harbors capable of holding hundreds of warships, with walls so thick that stables for war elephants and barracks for soldiers were built into them, with temples and palaces that rivaled anything in the Greek world. Carthage's military relied heavily on mercenaries, Numidian cavalry from North Africa, Iberian infantry from Spain, Balearic slingers, Greek hoplites. The city had relatively few citizens compared to Rome, and Carthaginian citizens were too valuable as merchants and administrators to risk in large numbers in battle. But Carthaginian generals were among the best in the Mediterranean, and Carthaginian wealth could buy the finest soldiers. The Carthaginian navy, manned by experienced sailors and built in the great shipyards of the circular naval harbor, was the strongest in the Western Mediterranean. The First Punic War began almost accidentally in 264 BC over a dispute involving the Mamertines, Italian mercenaries who had seized the city of Messana in northeastern Sicily. When they found themselves threatened by Syracuse, they appealed both to Carthage and to Rome for help. Carthage responded first, placing a garrison in Messana. But then the Mamertines changed their minds and invited Rome instead. Rome, despite having no legitimate reason to intervene and no tradition of fighting beyond Italy, saw an opportunity or a threat that could not be ignored. Sicily was close. Carthaginian control of Messana would give Carthage a foothold on the Italian side of the strait, the Senate debated. Finally, swayed by arguments about Carthaginian threat and the potential for plunder, Rome sent an army. The war that followed lasted 23 years and was fought primarily in Sicily, with campaigns also in North Africa and at sea. It was a war Rome had no business winning. Rome had no navy at the start. Its military strength was its legions, infantry armies designed for land warfare in Italy. Carthage had the finest navy in the Mediterranean, generations of naval tradition, experienced admirals and shipyards, capable of building hundreds of warships. But Rome did what Rome did best. It adapted, learned, and persisted. According to tradition, when a Carthaginian warship was wrecked on the Italian coast, Romans studied it, reverse-engineered its design, and built an entire fleet based on that single captured ship. They trained rowers on wooden frames set up on land, practicing the motions until they could coordinate. They developed a new weapon, the corvus, a boarding bridge with a spike that could be dropped onto enemy ships, locking them together and allowing Roman soldiers to board and fight hand-to-hand, turning naval battles into infantry combat, where Rome's superior soldiery could prevail. The strategy worked. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 BC, Rome won its first significant naval victory, capturing or sinking numerous Carthaginian ships. Roman confidence soared. An expedition was sent to North Africa under the consul Marcus Atilius Regulus, who landed an army and defeated Carthaginian forces near Carthage itself. Regulus demanded Carthaginians surrender on humiliating terms. The Carthaginians, desperate, hired a Spartan mercenary general named Xanthippus, who reformed their army and defeated Regulus decisively. Regulus was captured and his army destroyed. A Roman fleet attempting to evacuate survivors was wrecked in a storm. Rome lost hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men in a single disaster. But Rome rebuilt. New fleets were constructed. New armies raised. The war ground on. Sicily became a wasteland, its cities besieged and sacked repeatedly. Both sides exhausted their treasuries, but Rome, drawing on the manpower of all Italy, could sustain losses that would have broken most states. In 241 BC, at the Aegates Islands off western Sicily, a Roman fleet decisively defeated a Carthaginian supply fleet. Carthage, financially exhausted and facing rebellion by its unpaid mercenaries, sued for peace. The treaty was harsh. Carthage evacuated Sicily entirely, which became Rome's first province, governed by a Roman magistrate rather than being incorporated as allied territory. Carthage paid a massive indemnity, and a few years later, when Carthage was distracted by the mercenary war, a brutal rebellion by soldiers who had not been paid, Rome seized Sardinia and Corsica as well, adding them as a second province. The humiliation festered. Carthage turned to Spain to rebuild its power, developing silver mines and recruiting new armies from the fierce Iberian tribes. The Barca family, Hamilcar Barca and his sons Hannibal and Hasdrubal, led this effort, essentially creating a Carthaginian empire in Spain that was their personal domain. Hannibal, who had been brought to Spain as a child and made to swear eternal hatred of Rome, grew up among soldiers, learned warfare from his father, and dreamed of revenge. The Second Punic War began in 218 BC, when Hannibal, now commanding Carthaginian forces in Spain, besieged Saguntum, a city allied with Rome. Rome demanded he withdraw. He refused, anticipating Roman invasion of Spain or North Africa. Hannibal did the unexpected. He marched his army, including war elephants, across the Pyrenees, through southern Gaul, and over the Alps into Italy. The crossing of the Alps was an epic of suffering and determination. Hannibal lost nearly half his army to cold, starvation, avalanches, and attacks by hostile mountain tribes. Most of the elephants died, but he emerged in northern Italy with a corps of veteran troops and immediately began recruiting Gauls who hated Rome. When Roman armies met him, he destroyed them. At the river Trebia in December 218 BC, he ambushed and annihilated one consular army. At Lake Trasimene in 217 BC, he caught another Roman army in a defile and slaughtered it, killing the consul and 15,000 men. Rome was in crisis. The normal strategies weren't working. The dictator Fabius Maximus, appointed to deal with the emergency, tried a new approach: avoid battle, shadow Hannibal's army, cut off foraging parties, wait for him to weaken. The Fabian strategy, as it became known, bought time but frustrated Romans who wanted vengeance. When Fabius's term ended, the new consuls decided on decisive battle. At Cannae in August 216 BC, Hannibal faced a Roman army of perhaps 86,000 men, the largest army Rome had ever fielded. He had perhaps 50,000. The battle was a masterpiece of tactical genius. Hannibal arranged his infantry in a crescent, weaker in the center, strong on the flanks. As the Romans pushed forward, the center gave way deliberately, drawing the Romans deeper, while the strong flanks closed in, and Hannibal's cavalry, having routed the Roman cavalry, attacked from the rear. The Romans were surrounded, pressed together so tightly they could not fight effectively. The slaughter lasted hours. Somewhere between 50 and 70,000 Romans died, including both consuls, numerous senators, and the core of Rome's military strength. It was the worst defeat in Roman history. Any other state would have sued for peace. Rome's Italian allies waited to see what Rome would do. Many southern Italian cities defected to Hannibal. Capua, the second city of Italy, joined him. Syracuse in Sicily rebelled. Philip IV of Macedon allied with Carthage. Rome seemed finished, but Rome did not surrender. The Senate met, thanked the surviving consul for not despairing of the Republic, and began raising new armies. Slaves were enlisted, a thing previously unheard of. Boys too young for service and old men past it were formed into legions. Every citizen gave what they could to the war effort. The wealthy funded ships and equipment. The streets of Rome filled with women in mourning, but there was no talk of peace. Hannibal marched up to the gates of Rome but did not lay siege, perhaps because he lacked siege equipment, perhaps because he hoped the city would surrender. It did not. His Italian allies expected him to defeat Rome quickly, but Rome would not be defeated. And Hannibal, for all his tactical brilliance, had no way to attack a fortified city with a huge population and strong walls. The war became a grinding stalemate in Italy. Hannibal controlled southern Italy, but could not deliver a knockout blow. Rome could not defeat him in open battle, but prevented him from taking Rome or other major cities. Meanwhile, Rome struck elsewhere. A young general named Publius Cornelius Scipio took the war to Spain, defeating Hannibal's brothers and conquering Carthaginian Spain, cutting off reinforcements and resources. When Hasdrubal Barca finally brought an army over the Alps to reinforce Hannibal, he was defeated at the Tiber River in 207 BC. His head was thrown into Hannibal's camp. In 204 BC, Scipio, now called Africanus, landed an army in North Africa. Carthage panicked and recalled Hannibal from Italy, after 15 years of campaigning. At Zama in 202 BC, Hannibal and Scipio faced each other for the first and only time. Scipio used Hannibal's own tactics against him, using superior cavalry to attack from the flanks. Hannibal's army was defeated. Carthage surrendered. The treaty stripped Carthage of its empire. Spain became a Roman province. The Carthaginian fleet was reduced to 10 ships. Carthage was forbidden from waging war without Roman permission. A crushing indemnity was imposed, and Carthage survived only because Rome wanted it to. A neutered rival, a lesson to others about the price of challenging Rome. Hannibal, stripped of power, eventually fled Carthage to avoid being handed over to Rome. He served various Eastern kings as a mercenary and advisor, always fighting against Rome where he could. In the end, cornered by Roman agents in Bithynia in 183 BC, he took poison rather than be captured. His last words were supposedly, "Let us relieve the Romans of their anxiety, since they find it tedious to wait for an old man's death." Rome had survived its greatest test, but the war had cost perhaps a third of Italy's adult male population. Whole regions were devastated, farms abandoned, families destroyed, and the war had changed Rome. Before Hannibal, Rome had been primarily an Italian power. After him, Rome saw itself as a Mediterranean power, destined to dominate, unwilling to tolerate rivals. The Third Punic War, from 149 to 146 BC, was less a war than an execution. Carthage had recovered economically, though it remained militarily weak and obedient to Rome. But the conservative faction in Rome, led by Cato the Elder, who ended every speech with Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, feared a resurgent Carthage. When Carthage defended itself against attacks by Rome's ally Numidia, Rome claimed it had violated the treaty by waging war without permission. Rome demanded Carthage hand over all weapons, and then that the city be abandoned and the population relocate inland. The Carthaginians, realizing Rome intended their destruction, chose to fight. The siege lasted 3 years, when the Romans finally broke through in 146 BC under Scipio Aemilianus, grandson by adoption of Scipio Africanus. The fighting was house to house, brutal and desperate. The city was destroyed. Survivors were sold into slavery. The site was cursed. The story that the ground was sown with salt is probably later invention, but the destruction was real. Carthage ceased to exist. In the same year, Rome destroyed Corinth in Greece, sending a message to the Hellenistic East about the price of defying Roman power. The Mediterranean was becoming a Roman lake. The 100 years of conflict with Carthage had forged Rome into something new, a ruthless imperial power, confident in its strength, willing to destroy utterly those who challenged it, capable of sustaining losses that would break other states and still emerging victorious. Walking the ruins of Carthage today, on the hills overlooking the Gulf of Tunis, you find Laius, the Phoenician city buried deep, the Roman city that was built later after Julius Caesar refounded the site, the Byzantine and Arab cities above that. But of Hannibal's Carthage, the city that nearly destroyed Rome, almost nothing physical remains. Rome was thorough, yet the memory persists of the general who crossed the Alps, who won every battle and still lost the war, who showed Rome that it could be beaten and forced it to become something harder, more determined, more dangerous than it had been before. The Punic Wars created the Roman Empire, not yet in name but in reality. Rome had proved it could not be defeated. The world would learn what that meant.